Vijay, this is a very ambitious book because you've not only sketched out what the challenges for the left are or have been, you've also identified a territory which is rather large, which you sometimes say left, but sometimes also call the hinterland land of the left, which is the Gandhian thoughts, the Gandhian socialism, which is not exactly Gandhian in its content. Then you have the Dravida movement, you have the Ambedkar philosophies. All that you have put in the hinterland of the left or a part of the left. Now, some questions on that, because Gandhi, to identify Gandhi with the left, is something which is very, I would say, both the Gandhi and the Gandhians and the left would be uncomfortable with. So how do you really do this?
Many years ago, I was reading Gramsci's The Modern Prince. And in The Modern Prince, Gramsci talks about how to write the history of communism and a communist party. Communist parties have a very curious problem of operating in the present and operating in the future at the same time. In other words, you're trying to work in the present, what people like Rosa Luxemburg called reform, and yet you're also working simultaneously in the future, revolution. In that sense, a communist party cannot operate alone. It always seeks out, in the field of play, allies. It seeks out an understanding of the different social forces that are available. In that sense, how is it possible to tell the history of the Indian communist movement without understanding, say, the important moment which I consider the Gandhian moment, which opens, let's say, in the 1920s, when, in a sense, in this period, the masses enter history as actors with the big mass struggles of the 20s and 30s.
And it's interesting to say that because you mentioned that in your book as well, that a lot of the early communists or the leaders of the communist parties who became leaders of the communist movement later were people who also encountered very early on caste. And this is in fact, this is something which drives a lot of them towards the Communist Party. So they might have been intellectually thinking left, but the caste system was a very important element. Now, here again, on the question of how you look at the caste, how you look at Ambedkar, you've talked about Ambedkar and the Labour Party, for instance, which is what he formed. That how do you see this dynamic playing? That what was its contribution to the left movement? What was left's contribution to this kind of movement?
No, it's perfectly true. I mean, I was surprised reading a series of autobiographies of important people in the Indian left. And I'm personally very interested in the idea of how does anybody get radicalized, particularly because you have to enter this bifurcated time of the present and the future at the same time. You have to, you give up a lot to enter the movement. So how do people get radicalized? It's so interesting. BTR, all of them write about how there was an incident in their childhood. They were playing football, and there were some Dalit children playing, and some upper caste person came and said, get them off the field. And they felt revolted by this injustice, and they act. It's a very common strain in Sundarayya's autobiography. They all write about this as happening in their childhood. I found that fascinating, and it's important that that be part of the story. It's also important to track how, one of the great, maybe, challenges to the movement has been you ignored caste. That's been one of the great challenges. That, why do communists not take caste seriously? It's a very interesting statement, and it has to be understood in many different ways. One, it has to be asked, is this true empirically? Is it true that the communist movement has neglected caste empirically? Is this factually correct? Well, it turns out if you look at the evidence, it's not factually correct. The communist movement has been very serious in its work engaging with questions of caste discrimination and oppression. I mean, admittedly, the most dramatic instances are in the issue of the of tribal rights questions, whether it's Tripura or Maharashtra or wherever. But it's also in the agrarian question. So when you look at these carefully, these are not class struggles alone. They're always mixed with questions of discrimination, identity, respect, etc. These are very complicated struggles. Now, I said when you ask this empirically, the answer is, this is not a correct statement empirically. If you ask this theoretically, there's a challenge here, because it's true that in many of the early writings, there was lack of significant emphasis given to the relationship between caste and class. Early M.N. Roy essays, he talks about caste and class and how to understand caste society in relation to class. Some of those essays are obviously mechanical. I mean, we're talking about 1925, 26, 27, up to 31. The understanding of communism was something that they were developing.
When you look at some of these issues, you talked about the socialists, for instance, and the crisis of socialists. Socialists put caste at the center of their ideology. You know very well, particularly if you talk about Lohia, that he did really make caste as his sort of basis of his discussions. Now, do you relate the rise of identity politics and the weakening of the socialist ideology or the crisis of the Socialist Party to also focusing on caste in exclusion of class or such issues?
I don't need to make that case because the socialists themselves made the case. I mean, let's say a couple of things about the socialist movement. One is, it's very interesting how there is actually very poor historiographic literature on the socialist movement. So if it's a tough situation in the communist movement where we haven't actually had very many histories, in the recent period, apart from books that deeply hate the communist movement, such as Ross Malik, for instance, who thinks the communist movement should have been flushed down the toilet at its inception. A similar statement was made recently by Kancha Elaya, that it should just go away. In the same way as there's been a limited, in the socialist movement, the literature has been actually very poor. There is no book called, a really good book, archival-based book, called The History of the Socialist Movement in India. There's no real account which tells you why the Lohia movement dissolved. What happens to their parties? Their parties become, in the neoliberal period, particular dominant caste, backward caste or, but dominant in certain areas, vehicles for their advancement.
Upward mobility.
Upward mobility, for that group's mobility. So who does Mulayam Singh Yadav lead? Who does Lalu Prasad Yadav lead? Who does Mr. Paswan lead? And so these become for particular caste groupings a vehicle for advancement or for jockeying for power, which is probably democratic and probably a useful thing in the larger scheme of things. 100 years from now, we may look back and say, this was an important period. It opened up and cracked the democratic space, possibly. But it also trampled on the socialist movement.
Coming back to the issue that you just touched upon, your liberal era. Before that itself, the left starts getting into government starting 57 in Kerala, then Bengal, coalitions, and then 77 onwards, a communist, 78 onwards, a communist left government. Now, there are two phases one can talk about. One is the phase where you could do reforms within the structure that was there, particularly land reforms, not so much in trade union terms, but definitely land reforms. That was possible. So you have touched upon it in great depth, what happened, the land relations, also giving women rights to pattas later on in Bengal. All that you have touched upon. But the crisis that you do mention is the fact that once the space starts going away, that means you've already done what you could, and you start still giving land, but the amounts of land you're giving are not that much. That how do you take the movement forward?
One of the great positions that Indian liberalism has is that it doesn't need a political party. It simply can create a policy institute and it can staff it with liberals and they can write position papers and they can, argue their case. Now, they have a certain kind of confidence because they don't actually talk about anything but the status quo with trimmings, the status quo with certain changes here and there, etc. So they don't ever feel like they need to build power to make their ideas respectable. Their ideas are typically already respectable. The problem for the communist movement or the left movement in general is that the ideas we have, they are not common sense. They are not ideas that are respected. They are not respectable ideas. To make our ideas respectable, you need power. You need organization. You need to fight to make people see that the ideas that you are claiming are real and not utopian. So that's a challenge that happens when the strength of a movement suffers. When the consensus through the Gandhian movement, through a period when certain reforms were possible, as you said, but even when the movement was strong, there was a possibility of arguing the case because you had organized strength behind those ideas. In other words, what I'm just saying is that liberal ideas have a different standing than communist ideas. Liberal ideas seemingly can stand on their own because they are backed by the organizational and power of the state, which already accepts the parameters in which they operate. But if you are arguing from outside the parameters of the status quo, you need power, you need strength. And for a long period, world history enabled that. And my favorite part of when I was writing the book was the last section, which is communism in neoliberal times. Why? Because I decided, see, everybody's going to ask, aren't you going to talk about Nandigram? And, how can you talk about the communist movement without going directly into Singur, Nandigram? You've sold out to neoliberalism. How can you not do that? It's duplicitous. You talk about it. So what I thought was, let me ask you a question in a book like this. Let's say, okay, let's take 91. What happens in the communist movement after 91? You want to reduce it to Nandigram. I will say, let's look at industrial policy in Bengal. But at the same time in Kerala, there's people's planning, decentralized development. How can these two things be happening in the same movement at the same time, and you're only interested in the first one? And that too, in a certain interpretation of the first one. So let's look at the second one as well.
But last point is that if the hinterland has sort of dried up, isn't it also an opportunity? Because these are also competitive left politics in some sense. You have the socialists, you have the Dravidian movement, you have the Ambedkarite movement. So if all of them sort of dry up and the left does not, then don't you think it's also an opportunity, not just the weakness that you also point out it is?
It always operated alongside in a complex relationship with social democratic parties. And there is, I think, somebody has to, I haven't thought about this, but somebody has to think about the relationship between a communist movement which upholds the final aim of communism. What Luxemburg called the final aim. If we give up the final aim, we will merely become reformers. The final aim is what radicalizes our reforms. So there's something about us working with parties that also see grotesque problems in the world and are able to draw people in who are as yet not comfortable with committing themselves to the final aim. There is a relationship that I think one needs to think about. So the relationship between a communist movement and a social democratic type movement is something to think about. Whether it's an opportunity and you take the space, or whether something will emerge in that space which will be an important ally forward, I think that's to be seen.
So you are saying that more than an opportunity, what we really need, or the left needs, are allies in this space who may not agree with the final aims, but would at least go part of the distance. Now, unfortunately, you don't have the...
Maybe. I'm not sure that I would phrase it quite like that.
And unfortunately, the problem is you cannot manufacture them.
You cannot
they
manufacture
have to be there.
Exactly. And so in that, why did we decide to call this book No Free Left? A, it's a traffic sign. And it's one of my favorite traffic signs, now disappearing. How many of you have seen the traffic sign, No Free Left? So few. Anyway, it's now disappeared. It's a great sign. That means, no left on a red light. Okay, so why no free left? Because the other part of no free left is, however much people think about these movements, it takes an immense amount of effort to just keep the ball going. And I think that's a very underappreciated thing, especially among people who are quick to criticize movements. You you made this error, you made that error. It's all fair enough. But you've got to understand, it's not easy to get the ball going. We've been out of date for over 100 years, but still seem to be important. So in that sense, I don't know. I agree with you, can't manufacture anybody there. But it would be nice
If they were
to
there.
have somebody there.
So I think I'll stop here asking Vijay questions.